Hey, can you guys hear? It's been connecting for like 4 minutes. I'm assuming my internet is like horrible or something. Can you guys hear me? Somebody confirm if you can hear me. It's like the most ridiculously sluggish thing from you right now.
Courtney, disregard my email.
Okay.
I'm out of town and I'm on a different time zone. So I was logged in earlier at two. I was logged in 2 o'clock here, basically, and that's
Okay.
why nobody was on. So I was thinking something was wrong with my connection, but it was me.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, for some reason it took me like 4 minutes. I was just like trying to log in now and it's like loading for 4 minutes or something. So so you were here early and I'm here late. In the middle, we have class. How is everybody? We're all okay, I'm going to assume. All right, let me pull up the lecture. All right. Chat box is open. And same as always, right? We're on lecture 13. We're pretty far in, so the drill has not changed. Just speak up if you want to talk about something. Type up if you want to type about something, and we can talk about that, whatever you want. So thermal stress, we're going to go through, going to recover some of the stuff we did in a little bit more detail from Monday, and then we'll talk about sweating, the nature of sweating, and the reason for it and how it works. And then on Friday, we'll get into performance, dehydration, and the effects of thermal regulation on performance. All of this stuff. This is the quickest. We will go through it. And at some point, we'll talk about it in actual, at the pace of acknowledgement, perhaps at the pace of learning, but at least at the pace of acknowledgement. So we are, and actually, but all of this stuff is pretty important because as we talk today about thermoregulation, what we have to do is we're going to, if these are going to muscles, to skeletal muscles, these capillary beds are encapsulating and surrounding and supplying skeletal muscles, what we need is capillary beds that are going to the skin in times of heat, in times of thermal load. When that is the stressor that we're up against, we're going to start vasoconstricting over here to shunt blood away from everything from your guts, from your core to your whatevers, to your muscles and stuff, and into the periphery. Now, metabolism is going to determine a lot of your need, and those muscles are still releasing a lot of metabolic byproducts, vasoactive metabolic byproducts. And so the muscles will still be collecting a lot of that blood flow, but you're going to be sending a lot of it into the periphery, into the periphery, right, to the skin, because that's where you're going to exchange. You're not going to exchange heat if the blood is hanging around your core. When we talk about the cold responses, what happens when you're out in the frigid weathers, that's like, let's send a bunch of blood to the core, let's not send it to the periphery. But when you are out in the heat, you're sending as much blood to the periphery as you can, just to offload it, to get rid of some of this heat as much as you possibly can. Okay, so there's a lot of contexts in which you're going to experience heat as a stressor, thermal load as a stressor. That stressor, while it might not be a biomechanical one, that load is not going to be placed on you like a backpack or a dumbbell or something. There is a stress that's placed on your cells and your organs and tissues and body systems, and you have to respond accordingly. And there's a lot of recreational and job, vocational, some competitive environments, and basketball is a common one because you run up and down that court, and off if you're playing like street ball, it's like urban basketball. It's a bunch of concrete. You're running up and down that asphalt, and it's like black asphalt. It's hot. It's collecting all of that heat. It's going to be way hotter than if you're playing frisbee on a lawn. If you're playing frisbee on a lawn, that temperature is nowhere near the asphalt. I mean, that stuff gets hot. And so if you're doing an aerobic sport, depending on the context in which you're doing it, there was also the Miami Heat against the San Antonio Spurs game where just the AC went out, and what that was like. The LeBron Jameses of the world are being carried off the court because they can't perform. So remember, we hold a a homeostatic temperature around there. Now it varies, right? It's going to vary, but in the 1860s, after 18 years of work in 1868, Carl Wunderlich published what was reportedly, like 25,000 tests. Who knows, how many tests were done, and if the nurse, it's not like he himself did all of those tests. But that's where the 98.6 came from, is axillary measurements, right? Let's throw it under the armpit, just pinch it, it's on your skin, and the skin is a lot colder than your core. Right? If you were to put a catheter way up inside of your insides, it's not going to be the same temperature as your skin, your forehead, or your skin. Same thing if you got a rectal thermometer, you got to really shove it up there. You have to actually get it up into your something close to your core. And so this 98.6, this is a 19th century assessment using 19th century equipment and not testing actual core temperatures. So 98.6 is not really, that's not what we should think of as some absolute. And again, 1992, we fast forward the world a lot of revolutions, and we're seeing these upper limits. So these upper, now there's diversity. One person is not another person. You're male, you're female, you are old, you're young, maybe racial things, depending on what time of day it is. The temperature is going to be different. Your core temperature is going to be different. And so some of these upper levels of, in the early morning, you're looking at, 99.9 should be regarded as the upper limit of normal. This was oral, what they were doing, oral temperature, which still isn't as good as real core temperature, but it's certainly better than the axillary stuff. So early morning and evening, there's going to be a little bit of diurnal variability. Diurnal, that's just going to be your 24-hour sleep-wake cycle. And we're going to have that same thing with temperature. We're going to have diurnal rhythms with temperature. Again, sex, race, maybe there are differences there. Not certainly, but it has been observed. It's not observed at St. Vincent in terms of males and females. There's no difference there. And I don't know if I explored race. I think I did, and the p-value was like 0.999 or something. But 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. That's going to be the lowest. 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. That's going to be the highest. And we did publish. Nathaniel and I published on this, the diurnal and circannual variation in body temperature. So look over the course of a few years, and in certain seasons, we're seeing elevated core temperatures. What seasons are they? The seasons you would expect. It's not winter. That's not the elevated time, right? So we're seeing summer as being an elevated time. So there are annual rhythms, and then there are daily rhythms in our core temperatures that we see pretty consistently. And the way we're measuring this stuff, there's a lot of modes of assessment. A lot of them are okay. Like a lot of these ones, this one's pretty poor. And the bladder, right? You gotta have a lot of pee to do the bladder one. You can't just kind of trickle it on there and say, oh, that's it. You have to kind of midstream urine when you really have to go. The urine has been hanging out in your bladder for a while. The tympanic or the intra-oral inside, it's pretty good. Don't like, um, bust the tympanic membrane or anything, but that's okay. You know, this no, I don't know. Radio pill, you got to collect the thing, and it depends where it is inside of you. And pulmonary catheter, super invasive, and so the rectal tends to be the best one. I had a class with Lawrence Armstrong, multiple classes with him when I was doing my PhD. But he's a thermal regulatory guy, you know, one of the leading names in the world in this, and he would teach class while wearing. I mean, he's up there standing in front of the class lecturing, and he has his rectal thermometer in at the time, and he occasionally reported his body temperature to the class. And it's fascinating. He's like, you know, it doesn't really get in the way. You don't really notice it. And there's a lot of literature on this. There's literature on people will be doing, say, a cycle ergometer test, and while riding the bike, they have the rectal thermometers in there to measure time. So it's not like it's some insanely invasive thing that you're just like, oh, this is so uncomfortable the whole time, right? So it's I mean, it gets up there a little ways, but I mean, it's not like one of those mouth thermometers where you have like a big stick up your ass or something. But when we're looking at rectal temperature, it's going to be a little bit different. It's going to be higher than oral temperature. Oral is pretty close to the outside world. You open your mouth sometimes, you breathe out of your mouth sometimes, you just chewed some food, you drank some water, whatever. And the axillary, we're looking at a pretty big difference between the armpit and rectal thermometer. So injuries, you remember this idea about injuries where if we are at heat exhaustion, okay, we're at heat exhaustion, you know, maybe we're experiencing some symptoms here. Definitely we're very lethargic, but the core temperature, I don't know, it's 40 degrees Celsius, sort of maybe somewhere around there, right? The upper limit, 104 Fahrenheit around there, the upper limit, we're experiencing a lot of exhaustion and probably some additional effects. But you know, we're sweating. We're still like a human being. We're like an exhausted human being. Somebody, what you would look like if you were you know, under great heat stress, like, oh, I am winded, I need a place to sit down, I'm thirsty. So you're having all this normal cognitive function, normal circulatory function. And then once you go up about another degree, right, you go up to about 41 degrees Celsius, 106 Fahrenheit, somewhere in there, then that's where you start to see circulatory instability. Your blood circulation is not doing what you want it to be doing. I mean, you have enzymes denaturing. I mean, you have your central nervous system is just sort of thrown in the towel. You get loopy, you stop sweating, all of this stuff. You stop thermal regulation. Right over here on the mere, like, you know, heat exhaustion, you know, and you're very hot, but you're surviving. You're dissipating heat. You're still trying to regulate. Over here, you just sort of stop trying to regulate. And now heat accumulation is extreme, especially if you don't start cooling, don't get in an ice bath, something like that. We'll talk about ice baths as the athletic training staple. If you look up the work by Doug Casa, he's at the Corey Stringer Institute at UConn. He's the probably biggest advocate of ice baths because one saved his life once, and he went and became this sort of world-renowned researcher in heat stroke and heat exhaustion and management of thermal loads, and how effective an ice bath would be, because there used to be opposition to it. It's like, no, no, no. You have to put on a damp towel. You have to put on a moist towelette on their skin. That's what you have to do. If you dunk them in a tank, then you're just going to get a bunch of peripheral vasoconstriction. If they're not sending any blood to the periphery, then they're not going to cool, right? There's that gradient, gets really stark, and they just send all their blood to their core to try to preserve heat. And you just get this automatic, immediate vasoconstriction in the periphery, and so you don't exchange heat. So put on a moist towelette. Yeah, I guess if you want to kill people, that'll work. It doesn't do anything though to cool them down. You know, if ice baths didn't work, nobody would ever get hypothermia in the ocean. You know, every Titanic, you know, like overboard body would have just swam as far as they could have. You know, like I could. I can swim to the nearest whatever. Just drag me behind the lifeboat. I'll be fine. I'm not going to get hypothermia. Uh, but like they get hypothermia immediately. Why? Because that's the most effective way to cool, is throw you in an ice bath. ice back in an ice bath. There's nothing that can compare to that. And the little damp towelettes and stuff in the literature don't really seem to do anything. But this car, what we were talking about is you get signs, you get symptoms, you get expressions of overexertion and heat tolerance. You're at your capacity. Oh, pull over. All right, pull over now. Open up the hood, let the car cool down. You don't need to go all the way. Like if it's a marathon, you're like, yeah, but I'm at mile 22. Okay, but it's just running a couple of miles and there's really no reason to do it. Is there $1 million at the end? Are you saving someone's life in doing so? What is the prize here? Well, satisfaction. Okay, you're going to be really unsatisfied for potentially the rest of your life if you wind up with a very chronic version of heat stroke that affects you for the rest of your life. And like, so what's the point of running the last? What's the run of running a marathon anyway? But what's the point in those last couple of miles if you're up against heat stroke? You're just going to potentially ruin your whole life, maybe die for no reason. So it's really important to manage thermal lows, to pay attention, to stay hydrated, to understand signs and symptoms, whether it's somebody you're monitoring, if you're working at the medic's tent at an event, or you're an athletic trainer in the summer, it's football in the summer months or something like that. It's really important to be vigilant and to allow that vigilance to act, to allow your vigilance to take action when necessary. So heat cramps, we're going to talk about cramps Friday or Monday. We'll get to cramps. Syncope, that's just passing out. And then over here we have exhaustion, sort of the signs, symptoms of exhaustion. And heat stroke, this is where you just sort of give up, not on purpose. So who is at risk? When and where are we going to encounter these things? Well, age is a big variable. When this heat wave comes and strikes, whatever, it's Chicago, it's Stockton, it's wherever a heat wave strikes, the older people, just like with COVID, the older people, they are more at risk. And so, all right, old folks, let's get you into the grocery store, hang out in the cheese aisle, the yogurt, the dairy aisle, go hang out in that aisle. There's a bunch of just refrigerators blowing into the aisles. Just hang out there. Let's just pack you in. Now, today, that would be hard to do owing to COVID, and viral illness is another risk factor. Viral illness is a risk factor for a lower tolerance. Your heat tolerance ceiling sort of creeps down, and pretty soon you're hunching under that thing. You really got to manage your heat. Acclimatization, that's the in nature version. Acclimation, you're doing it in a lab. If you're not acclimated or acclimatized, then that's a risk factor. You can adapt to this just like anything. Put yourself in an environment, and over time you're going to adapt to that environment. You are going to be more capable of tolerating that stress, tolerating more of that stress, a greater magnitude, tolerating that same magnitude for longer. But if people aren't acclimated, that's going to impair them. Attire, right? It depends what you're wearing. I have a picture of one of our former students. We'll get to it in a minute. She's wearing a burqa, and she went shopping and she nearly had a heat stroke because she wasn't used to it. And um body composition, our gentleman pushing his own wheelbarrow over here, that's a big deal. I mean, if the higher your body composition gets, the worse you're able to dissipate heat, and potentially more you create. Any amount of activity, take a few steps. Because you can do the same thing, put on a backpack that weighs 100 pounds and walk up a flight of stairs. You're sweating at the top of the stairs, and you might not have been sweating at the bottom of it. So you get a heat stroke. Hopefully, this is not you. This is a figurative you. If it's a literal you, we should have, tried harder to avoid it, or at least I'm sympathetic. But there's a lot of examples of this. Chicago is just the best one in the 90s, 1995, right? Chicago, that heat wave. I mean, there's 3,300 people are hospitalized for this thing. There's thousands of hospitalizations and almost 700 deaths. I think 692 deaths. This is a big deal. This heat wave. But researchers didn't track everybody. They didn't track everybody. They just tracked 58 patients. It was a small sample from a larger population. They tracked 58 patients, and they're discharged. Like, okay, you're stable. You are stable. We think you are recovered or something close to it. You are exhibiting signs that we can discharge you and not worry about litigation. You don't step off the curb and the heat stroke gets the best of you. You're out of here. We'll see you later. We have too many patients and we're understaffed and we think you're okay. So they discharge a lot of them. Now a bunch die, right? A bunch of the patients died, but among the patients they discharged, a third of them had not recovered in a year. A third of them who were discharged, like, okay, you're good enough to not be in the hospital. A year later, they are still suffering from this. You see the same thing with concussions, very extreme concussions. It's a year later and people are still having neurological deficits. We've published on that. It's a year later, it's 18 months later, as we're 2 years in and I still can't do my multiplication tables, or I can't do the maze, and my reaction time is what, and so you still see these chronic deficits with things like concussions and heat stroke, right? If the heat tolerance overwhelms you, or overtraining, right? We have a threshold, and if you break it, that's bad, right? With overtraining syndrome, not overreaching. Overreaching is like heat exhaustion. Yeah, fine, just go get cold and we will bounce back. Maybe you'll finish the race, but you're not going to finish in a time that you're happy about. But we'll get you through the race. Just let's cool you down for a bit first. So if you go from overreaching to recovery, yeah, you're going to get back to it. If overreaching and you push it and push it and push it and push it, now you're in overtraining, that may be lifelong. That may be, you may kick yourself or you kick your coach, right? Whoever your coach was, you may like curse their name forever and think they're some demon incarnate who's here to ruin lives. Because overtraining can affect you for an awfully long time. It will affect you for a long time, but potentially an awfully long time. It's the same thing with heat stroke, right? You get heat exhaustion, and that's like overreaching. You can bounce back from that. But if you get a heat stroke, a third of these patients, it was a year later, and they still can't do shit, right? They're still just like exhausted. Same thing with COVID. It's the same thing with everything. You're detecting a theme here. It's the same thing with everything. With COVID, some people get this and they bounce back and they're okay. Some people get it. It's like, man, I got this in, April or something of last year, right? We're almost coming up to a new April and my VO2 max is worse than my grandma's. And we see this in a surprising number of people. I have no idea what the percentages are or something like that. But from this one study, it was a third of people didn't recover. And 28% of them died that year. Died. They recovered. They were discharged from the hospital. You look stable. Get out of here. Here's your discharge papers. And almost all of them is within the first 12 weeks of the people who died within the first 12 weeks. Few months later, they're dying of complications. And so this is not an acute thing. Heat stroke, like, okay, you know what? We threw you in the ice bath. Let's get you racing tomorrow. That's not how it works, right? This is serious. Heat load, you cross a threshold and it becomes serious. Same thing with, I could talk about mold toxicity, and I've read 300 journal articles about mold toxicity. There's a certain threshold where it's like, okay, we'll get you out of the mold and you're going to bounce. It might take a few months, right, to bounce back, 3 months, 6 months, something like that, to bounce back. You cross a threshold and you have massive organ damage. Does that recover? No, that doesn't recover. That is your companion for life now. And it's that way with so many things. And so it's so important. It's so important to be mindful, vigilant, observant, be aware, be whatever you want to call it. Keep your eye on symptoms and side effects and potential compromise, because you cross a threshold and it joins. It's a guest that won't leave. That thing's going to overstay its welcome and it's going to just dig into capacities. So avoid this stuff. Now, what actually goes wrong when you're doing something like overheating, heat stress, enzymes, right? We've all fried an egg. We know what denaturing proteins look like, but you don't have to get that far, right? You're not like, your enzymes aren't going and like sizzling and stuff. You don't like grease the pan and your enzymes are like crackling and sizzling in there, but you can still denature these things. And there's an optimal performance, right? There's an optimal temperature. It depends on what enzyme you're looking at. It depends on the enzyme, and it depends on the heat and the duration of heat. All of these things depend. But the increase in temperature or the decrease in temperature, but especially the increase in temperature, we're looking at some compromised enzyme performances. Hemoglobin, right? Hemoglobin, this is Christian Bohr down here. It's called the Bohr effect, is this relationship we have, and we'll get into this a little bit more on Friday, the Bohr effect, as we talk about carbon dioxide and pH, when we talk about these things and their effect on the oxygen dissociation curve. But if you increase the temperature, if you start getting the local temperature up, metabolism, that's generating heat, right? There's, depending on what you're doing, 60% to 80% of your metabolism being released as heat, not going to your locomotive stuff, not going to the verb that you're currently performing. It's going to just heat generation, 60%, 80%, depends on the intensity of your exercise, the situation. But you start exercising, and the local tissues, those muscles that are contracting and consuming all of that ATP, consume it faster, they're producing more heat. Consume it slower, they're producing less heat. But that heat is a flag. It's almost like a chemotactic flag. It's signaling over here, over here, over here. Here is where I need oxygen, right? And so the hemoglobin, you increase the temperature, and that affinity gets a little bit more loose. That relationship gets a little bit less tight, a little bit less clingy, and so that helps escort oxygen to its rightful destination. Elevated core temperature reduces the effectiveness of that oxygen dissociation curve. Increased core temperature sort of confuses the system a little bit. Like everything's hot. I don't know where to drop this off. It's just like everything is. There's flags all over the place. It's. I was given an address, and like every house has the same address on it. Where am I supposed to give this to? And so that's how temperature, when you get core temperature increasing, oxygen delivery to the target tissues can get a little bit compromised. Now, blood volume is going to decrease. You're going to start depleting, sweating out your blood volume during exercise. The We all know how much you sweat during exercise. More fit people are going to sweat more. Watch Van Ness, lecture, and he's sweating a lot. He's a good athlete. Van Ness he's a good aerobic athlete, and I mean he starts sweating during lecture. It's this anticipatory response for exertion. Now, do you need to cool during lecture? I don't know, not really, but maybe a little bit. I don't know. It depends on the room. It depends if like the AC's busted and how many bodies are in there and stuff. But you can tell somebody who sweats a lot. People are usually embarrassed by it. They're sitting there, they're getting like the chest ring and the pit sweat and whatever. Well, pit sweat's maybe a little bit different because that's more apocrine, but the chest sweat and the forehead sweat and all these things, that's the eccrine sweat glands. That's to cool you down, and better athletes are going to experience more of that, earlier onset and more of it. We'll talk about it, but the more you sweat, the more fluid you lose. Fluid goes away if you're sweating more. When you lose fluid, blood volume goes down. So you lose fluid, and blood volume is depleted a little bit. If blood volume is depleted a little bit, stroke volume goes down. Look over time what happens, right? Stroke volume is going down. Now, you're going to get a reduction in skin blood flow at some point also, and that's going to compromise cooling in longer term, very endurancey exercise. But in response to a decrease, a reduction in stroke volume, you have to increase heart rate. You got to maintain your total cardiac output. Like, man, is it going to go down a little? Maybe, sure, but heart rate is going to go up, and especially in hyperthermia. What you see, hyperthermia, the more extreme it is, the more cardiac drift you will experience. Hyperthermia, extreme temperatures, more sweat, more fluid loss, less blood, lower stroke volume with every beat. You're going to start beating that heart faster. So a higher temperature corresponds to more cardiac drift. And then the oxidative
So,
metabolic. Yeah, go ahead.
before you move on, so with the blood volume, so I wrote down more sweat equals loss of fluid equals blood volume decrease, which equals stroke volume decrease. So is that a good thing? Because you're saying that people that are more fit, they sweat more, but like, why is that a good thing?
For
How is that a
cooling,
good thing?
cooling is gonna harm you way faster. Well, compromised cooling response is going to harm you and compromise your performance way faster than any cardiovascular deficit of like, look, yeah, the heart has to beat a few extra beats per minute, there's some extra work here. So our cardiovascular system is not performing quite as optimally as it could. That's not as important as our temperature is going up. Thermal regulation is so critical to human performance. Remember, this is where we're very adapted to do this. That Daniel Lieberman stuff, the persistence hunting. How were we such good hunters? We don't have, like, our teeth suck, right? They barely do anything. And we're like some of the worst sprinters in the world. We value sprinting probably because we're horrible at it. I mean, just about everything thinks we're a joke, and they're right. We are a joke in terms of sprinting. Usain Bolt is a hilarious joke in the animal kingdom. I mean, he's like the sluggishest creature in the wilds that's ever lived. He's just fast for a human, but that's like ridiculous. That's like, oh, I don't know. Andre the Giant is enormous. Yeah, but is he like an elephant? Well, he's like bones now, but elephants think he's like a little tiny hobbit. Like, so he's not like huge compared to elephants. And that's us sprinting. The world is filled with sprinting elephants, and we're not one of them. But we are really good marathon runners. Some of the best in the world, right? Horses aren't as good as we are. If we, for a trained person, I'm not going to beat a horse, but for a trained marathon runner, they're going to beat the horses. And we have this incredible cooling response. So Daniel Lieberman's work is in persistence hunting and the evolutionary adaptation of Homo sapiens, and why we have this upright bipedal form that seems so equipped for endurance running in the heat. Again, take your dog for a walk around the block in the summer, and you're going to need to have the dog's going to need to find shade and pant for a while for its version of evaporative cooling in its mouth. And sort of esophageal and mouth, and like that kind of cooling. uh but so that is our biggest threat. And so the persistence hunting, we run after an antelope or something and then it dies of a heat stroke, and we're fine, right? Yeah, we got some cardiac drift. Our heart's beating faster than it should have in this situation, but we survived. And our prey didn't, because they couldn't sweat. They have fur, they couldn't sweat. That fur is compromising their cooling. Convection and evaporation, the fur is compromising their cooling, and we're just cooling away. And so we survive, and nature is just deceased. And then we can rest and drink fluids and recover our cardiovascular function, but we survived. And so that's how critical heat is. It's more important than acute cardiovascular disruption of normal function. Thermal regulation trumps it. It's so important. And so that's the reason a really fit person is the onset of sweating is going to happen more quickly. You can lick their arms and lick their foreheads and whatever, and you won't get as much sodium. Yeah, I don't know that you're going to hydrate on it. So if somebody's really aerobically fit and you go up and start licking their forehead, I don't know that you're going to find yourself more hydrated. But you can do a taste test, like a blindfolded taste test, and we'll just bring a bunch of foreheads in front of you and you lick them, and you can say, oh, this person's aerobically fit. You could tell the difference. And I mean, I don't think we should do that as a lab. Certainly not while I'm tenured, because then I don't know that I would have a class to teach next semester. But the critical importance of thermal regulation is the answer to that one. Um, so metabolism, you're going to become a lot more glycolytic, way more glycolytic. Some of this is going to be the circulatory disruption, right? So if you're not getting as much oxygen to the skeletal muscles that are working owing to a number of phenomena, then what is the alternative, right? What do we default to? Glycolysis, right? If we're not getting enough oxygen, let's just ramp up glycolysis. Now, glycolysis is less efficient, but also we are suppressing aerobic metabolisms. We're suppressing oxidative aerobic metabolisms, lipolytic stuff, lipolysis, right? Let's release some free fatty acids. Adipose, triglyceride, lipase, things like that. We are appear to be impairing, and at the same time, we are reducing the amount of oxygen. We are increasing the amount of glycolytic metabolism. Lots of literature on this. If you just look at these different heat loads. And this is glycogen concentration before and after exercise. So lower heat, you go from 567 to 401. Higher heat and humidity, 545 to 326. There's a bigger drop off. You see the same thing over here. This drop off, and this is a heated limb and a control limb. And in a heated limb versus a control limb, you're seeing this bigger drop off in glycogen content. So you're using more glycogen, which implies less fat. All you have to do is measure glycogen, because the ATP consumption is not changing. What's changing is the source of ATP reconstitution. And so we become much more glycolytic, much less oxidative, the hotter we get. And that's also going to compromise performance pretty enormously. Now, we've known about the central nervous system compromise for a really long time, right? 1919, here's Francis Bainbridge, this guy talking about this, but he's like, even in these ergographic experiments, Mosso long ago stated that nervous fatigue, right? So this is not a new concept, but lots of stuff gets disrupted. Tons of explanations for the central nervous system's disruption of performance, and why you're seeing this, or how rather you're seeing this neuronal compromise during heat stress. So it talks about there's thermotoxicity involved occurs via cellular, local, and systemic mechanisms. Okay, systemic, local, and cellular mechanisms goes through some different explanations of how this heat begins to affect systemic, local, and cellular things that are going to compromise your cerebellum from doing its thing. A lot of animal studies also, like, what have we learned from these animal studies? And one interesting thing here is that there's a range, there's a time, but expression of thermotolerance after a conditioning heat dose was clearly observed. And so the central nervous system is one area in which you can improve your ability to tolerate heat. The central nervous system function can tolerate heat better. You subject yourself to stress, specificity of adaptation, you become better at tolerating that particular stress. And but it gets pretty narrow. If all you do, oh, I'm going to sneeze. I'm sorry if that was super loud. If that was like super loud in your ears, I'm sorry. But if all you do is go lie around in the heat. People used to try this, before anybody knew physiology. It's like, okay, we're going to have, the World Cup is being hosted somewhere super hot. Let's take our team there a month in advance, and we'll train in sort of a climate controlled situation so that we can get used, we can still practice at full speed and full duration. We don't want to go out and practice for 8 minutes and have everybody call it quits for the day. But then we're just going to spend the rest of the day wandering around, sleeping in the heat. Okay, thanks, JP, for the blessing. We're going to sleep in the heat and shop in the heat and lounge in the heat. Okay, but that's not training in the heat. Specificity of adaptation. You're still going to be shitty at training in the heat. You're just going to get good at shopping in the heat. You're going to learn to tolerate that, but you're not going to get good at soccer in the heat. And so there's a specificity of adaptation, but there is a tolerance. There's a heat tolerance that can be developed. Okay, storage and transfer. Let's pick up here. This is what we went through this last time, but let's go through it with some different words and same information, but we'll phrase it in different whatever analogies and stuff. Because this part is so important. I just want to make sure everybody gets this equation of the storage of heat and the exchange, the transfer of heat. So to function, enzymes and cardiovascular function and the nervous system, everything. To function, we need to have our, let's call it 37 Celsius. It's not exactly that, but we have to have our core temperature. If you depart that core temperature, you depart optimal performance. If you depart that core temperature even farther, right now you're a couple of degrees away. So you're compromising performance more. You're risking injury. You're risking illness. You're risking death at some point. The farther and farther and farther you go from your core temperature, the more compromise you're going to experience. Now, acutely short-term performance, increasing intramuscular temperature, that's helpful. And we'll talk about that on Friday. Increasing intramuscular performance or intramuscular temperature for acute performance is valuable. There's a warm-up that is valuable. But if what follows that warm-up is a marathon, you cool up first, cool down, whatever. It doesn't matter up or down and whatever the direction is. Cool yourself before you perform. That's going to be more advantageous than doing the warm up because you're going to warm up 30 seconds into your race. You're going to be all hot and heating up beyond what you were hoping you would. So pre-cooling in that situation, but understanding the right context, the right prescription for some of this stuff, and your core temperature when you're measuring temperatures throughout your body. Remember, like, your skin tends to be pretty cool, your core tends to be pretty hot, pretty homeostatic. Your arms and legs, right, these are going to be lower than your core temperature. um, and you're going to have this gradient, right? You're going to have your skin out here, you're going to have your organs over on this side, and there's going to be a gradient. And you want to preserve a nice gradient to manage the transfer of heat. Obesity can affect that gradient. Obesity can affect thermal transfer owing to this a little bit of modification to this gradient. And alcohol, we'll talk about alcohol later this semester, that can also modify this gradient. You just sort of stop controlling where your blood goes, and blood goes to the skin like, oh, I feel warm. Yeah, and you're going to get hypothermia like 10 times faster because of how warm you feel. That's going to kill you first. So that's a a delusional oasis. I mean, that is this mirage that's gonna murder you when you get there. But we manage this. You get out in the cold, and what do? You tighten up this gradient, right? You send all the blood to the core, and you try to not let this gradient have much thermal transfer. So that's part of how we're transferring stuff. So 98 point whatever degrees, 37 give or take degrees. This is the temperature of our quote core. The core is not, I'm not talking like your abs and your multifidus and all of these, the erector spinae and maybe a hip flexor. That's not what I mean by your core. Your core temperature, right? Use your organs. Your organs are your core in this case. If you go to some thermal physiology conference and talk about core exercises, they're not going to know what the hell you're talking about. So contextual. Yeah, does a core exist in exercise? Sure, fine, core. But in thermal physiology, what we mean is organs, heat storage in your organs. Those organs are going to give up on you if you don't manage the heat right. And metabolism, right? Your production of energy. This is where most of your heat is coming from. This is the reason, remember that little lizard or whatever say if your temperature is 98.6 degrees, why do people complain when it's 98 degrees outside? Well, because you can't release all of that metabolic heat that you're generating. It's so uncomfortable. That's why 98 degrees feels, you get all lethargic and you can barely move. Is if you move a lot, you're going to generate even more metabolic heat production. You're not efficient, right? You are not this efficient machine of consumption where every calorie burned is a calorie moved. I can run a marathon on so few calories because I am so efficient at burning them. No, you're not. That's not how a human body works. It's really not even how like machines work. uh, and but we're not that efficient of one. Now, with every you know swing phase in your gait, with every rep in your exercise program, every time you turn over in bed to roll over onto the opposite side. Man, I've been laying in bed all day, it's quarantine, what am I going to do? I don't want to get a bed sore, I'm going to roll over on the other side. Okay, you're generating heat when you do that because it's metabolically not expensive, but there is a price tag. It's not free. And every single calorie you burn, the bulk of it, the bulk of that energy is released as heat. And we've known this for a really long time. Now, as your met value gets higher and higher, depending on, I don't know, are you cleaning a cabin at moderate effort? Okay, 3 times your resting metabolism, you're gonna start sweating a little bit here. Then you're sweating at rest. You're sweating. You are releasing some fluids at rest. Between zero point 0.3 and zero point 0.4, maybe a third of a milligram per centimeter per minute. You do have fluid loss at rest. Just because you can't see beads of sweat, that doesn't mean as it's forming, it just evaporates as it's forming. You're not accumulating sweat so quickly that it's beading. It's accumulating all the time. It's just most of the time, but it's evaporating it so you don't actually see it. But so you're going to start sweating a little bit more right here. There's going to be heat creation. But if you're butchering an animal that's large and vigorously doing it, now 6 times your resting metabolism, that's going to be you're going to be sweating during that. You're going to be dripping sweat on that butchered animal. So the metabolic heat production, and again, this is not a new concept. This is something that has been well accepted for a very long time. How it works, the precise physiological mechanisms, okay, we're coming to understand this a lot better today, but this is 100 years ago, 99 years ago. Archibald Hill, right, Nobel laureate, for saying muscle is not a steam engine, right? It does not take the heat and convert it to work. It is not a steam engine. That's not how it works. Heat is a byproduct, and the byproduct is the bulk of the work, right? That is doing. And so this is 100 years ago they figured out this, and again, during exercise, you're going to get more inefficient. You might be 20% of your ATP consumption, maybe contributing to that actual cycle ergometer. Might only be 20%. 80% of it is you're going to be sweating this thing out. Let's get some heat going. So metabolism, the biggest producer of heat, and there is a fitness level here. There is a body composition effect. There's a fitness level, and so this efficiency of heat, you can train this. But obesity, there tends to be a poor efficiency. If you just reduce body weight, you tend to improve the ATP, the amount of sort of locomotive energy consumption compared to pure heat production. And yeah, type 2 muscle fibers, these ones are going to be the least efficient, much more glycolytic, much less efficient. So you're going to be producing more heat with those things. So the intensity is going to matter, and the amount of skeletal muscle you have, and the amount of skeletal muscle that's contributing to your task, whatever your task is, the contribution of skeletal muscle. All of this stuff matters. The exertion, the amount of tissue involved, what muscle fiber types you're using, all of this stuff is going to contribute, as well as your conditioning level. Your conditioning level matters. So pretend uh, you are, I don't know, you're jogging, I don't know, let's say it's Michael Phelps is in the pool. And I don't know, Caitlin aside, any of us who are not talented swimmers, we get in the pool. Let's say it's me. I grew up with a pool. I'm mediocre at swimming. I'm not talented at swimming. I was never on swim team. I just swam a lot as a kid. So I'm not good. I'm just like, am I can I go up and back with a stroke that looks like a person who knows how to swim? Okay. Yeah, I can, that's my level. Michael Phelps does 10 laps. I do 10 laps. Let's say we're swimming at the same speed. I'm going to burn 5 times as many calories as he will. And it's going to be I'm going to be so hot and out of breath at the end. I'm going to be like, the pool is going to be filled with my salty sweat when we get to the end. Michael Phelps that was so boring. Do I have to do this again? Like, I burned like 6 calories. This is not a workout for me. I need to get on a bike. I need to run. I need to do something that I'm not talented at to burn a few calories. So think about specificity of adaptation and a lot of these sort of neuromuscular control and motor function, stuff like this also matters. But during exercise, 30%, maybe 20%, something like that is contributing to non-thermal activity in your body, the actual activity that you're doing. So you subtract the work accomplished. Your heat stored, how hot you are, your heat production is going to be your metabolic rate, and subtract the work accomplished. The work accomplished is not producing heat. Heat is a byproduct of the work accomplished. They're two separate things. Evaporation, this is our primary. It doesn't have to be, depending on circumstances, any of these could be primary. But I mean, go hop in, can be like you're like Hansel and Gretel or whatever, and you hop in the oven. Okay. I don't know, maybe it's like a convection oven. So there's other. I mean, that's gonna change your temperature most. Or go get in an ice bath. The opposite of that. The opposite of being a living gingerbread man and finding yourself in an oven. Get in an ice bath. Okay, you're not like, well, evaporation is my main source of thermal change. Like, no, it's not. So this is contextual. So when I say evaporation is your primary source of heat loss, that's in many situations. Most situations we find ourselves in, this is the primary mode of heat loss. And on the skin, right, on the skin is where you're going to see this during exercise, and in your mouth, right, maybe a little bit in your lungs, right, if you're a dog and you're panting, you're some sort of animal that doesn't have sweat glands. I think rats have sweat glands on their tails, but most critters have all life that isn't human, they don't have our sweating capacity. But so earlier I said during rest, maybe you're sweating 0.36 or so, 0.35 up to 0.4. It sort of depends on who you are. Milligrams per centimeter per minute. You get into exercise and maybe it's 0.85, 0.89, 0.9, maybe even higher. It's going to depend on obviously the nature of exercise, but you're going to more than double your amount of sweat. And if you do that, you should increase the amount of evaporation, unless the humidity is just outrageous. I mean, if you're hanging out in 100% humidity and you're super sweaty, evaporation is not going to work for you. That's another situation in which evaporation is not going to be your primary form of cooling. Because how do you evaporate? It's 100% humidity. Where are you supposed to deposit that sweat? It's just going to soak up into your back and stuff. That's all that's going to happen. So the humidity matters a great deal in terms of that sweat having somewhere to go, right? Some air to find itself cuddled up with. Now, moving on to convection, movement of fluids, convection, movement of fluids, gases and liquids. This is going to affect your temperature depending on the nature. I mean, if like it depends on what's moving over. Is it the same temperature as you? Well, that's not really helping anything. But if cool air, or cool water, or hot air, or hot water, or something like that is flowing over you, that's a convection that will alter your temperature. That's going to change your temperature. This can matter a lot. Let's say you're a dog and you're in a car, and it's 100 degrees inside the car. Now it's 102. Now it's 105. And dogs don't have sweat glands, and they can pant, right? That's their sweating is a form of evaporation. It's not their sweating, but their sort of salivation and evaporation. And if you turn on a fan, you're like, yeah, the car's parked, but the fan is blowing full blast. That's a convection oven. That makes it hotter. That's going to heat them up faster because they're not sweating, and that heat isn't being turned into sweat, and then little beads of sweat and evaporating and cooling them that way. So all you're doing when you turn on the fan is accelerating the heat stroke. You're accelerating the death when it's funny how people do that. Like, oh, I'm going in 10 minutes. But I'm going to really turn the fan on high. Like, that's the worst thing you could do. Why not just turn a heater on in the car? That's exactly as bad. I mean, so convection, that's how convection works. And we know swimsuits, right? And not swimsuits, but like a wetsuit or a dry suit, same thing. You're wearing a windbreaker. You go outside, you're wearing a coat. Sometimes clothes, the wind blows right through them. It's cold outside. I put on this one of my coats, the wind just blows right through it. It's fine if there's no wind. It keeps me really warm if there's no wind. If there's wind, it's like why wear anything at all? Like the wind just goes right through it. A windbreaker is to stop convection. That's what a windbreaker does. And so if you think of like a wetsuit, something like that, as a water breaker, right? This is the aquatic equivalent of a windbreaker. You're stopping convection. Conduction, this can go either way, right? Touch a hot thing, and whatever surface of you is touching the surface of that thing, you are going to exchange heat. It's going to take on some of your heat. You're going to take on some of its heat. So if you go sit on bleachers, there's wooden bleachers sometimes, like a picnic table. You go out and sit on a picnic table. That's like wooden bleachers. And it doesn't matter. It's like really cold outside, unless the picnic table is wet, unless it's also raining. If it's dry and cold outside, you sit down at the picnic table and you go, "Ooh, that freezes my bits." You don't say that. You wouldn't say that anyway. But you sit down on the picnic table and you don't really exchange any heat with it. It's terrible at conduction. It doesn't transfer heat readily. Bleachers, though, you're going to put down your blanket. You're going to put down whatever it is that you can put down on there, even some paper towels or your sweatshirt or whatever it is, you're going to put down on those bleachers, whether they're hot, they're cold, whatever. The thing's going to burn me, or it's going to be freezing, because they conduct well. Metal conducts really well. Put down a sweater. Cotton doesn't conduct well. Wood doesn't conduct well. Water does. Metal does. These things conduct really well.
Really quick.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm always. So for the convection, when you were talking about that, why is it really bad for you with the fan? Is it because the sweat allows you to cool, but when you sit in front of the fan, I don't see how that's a bad thing. Because like when people are at the gym, they go stand in front of the fan because they're really, really hot. Why is that a bad thing? I'm confused.
Okay, in a car for a dog, it's going to kill a dog because dogs aren't sweating. So if it's a non-human creature and you blow a fan on them and the temperature is hotter than they are, it's going to kill them, because that's just removing. You are increasing the amount of flow of hot air over their body. So if you think about like you're in water. All right. So last time we talked about water from the perspective of it's cold water that you're in, and you stand there and you're in the cold water and you don't move, and there's no waves. Nothing. There's no disturbance in the water. There isn't like a fish, where you're just sitting there and the water is sort of stagnant and cold. But after a little while, you create your own little aura. You create your own sort of encapsulating wetsuit of a kind. And There's a gradient, just like your body has a gradient from your core to your skin. There's a gradient. There's also a gradient in the water that's around you. A foot away, it's just as freezing as it is, 10 feet away. But a centimeter away, that water is warmer. Now, if you have this convection, if you start having the movement of that fluid, you don't warm up that water. Your skin and your body doesn't warm up that water. And so that gradient vanishes. And now you have a constant flow of that water over top of you, and you start to exchange heat very quickly. With air, it's the same thing. The air that's right around you is going to be a slightly different temperature, but movement of air tends to be good for us, unless it's 100% humidity. Movement of air tends to be good for us because we can sweat. That's going to be our primary mode of dissipation, of elimination of this heat, of reduction of temperature, is going to be movement of air. But if you're anything else, if you're a dog, you don't want to be anywhere near that fan, right? If that climate is hotter in the gym, let's say, than the dog's temperature, right? Get away from that fan. I mean, that thing is just convecting you to death. The exchange of heat is increased because you're not sweating. All you're doing is being heated by that convection. So for us, it's good. Go sit in front of the fan. It's hot out. Sit in front of the fan. You're sweating. The heat is evaporating, unless the humidity is really high, and then I would get away from the fan. So the conductivity of water and air, right? Water super conductive. Water is going to transfer heat really readily. That's what, when people get, I had that pool growing up, and it always confused me when I was a little kid of it's like 80 degrees outside. I'm like, I was in Oregon, so that was like really warm, and the summers weren't punishing as they are today. It's remarkable how different today is from when I was a kid. But so it was like, yeah, it's like 85 degrees in the summer. Like, it is so hot out. I'm going to get in the pool. How warm is the pool? Oh, it's 79 degrees. Oh, it's freezing in there, right? Because of the conduction, because it conducts so much better than air. And that you just begin to absorb 79 degrees. What's my body? Well, not 79 degrees. I don't know what my skin is. It's less than, less, it's under 37, under it's 90, under 98, whatever. But it's pretty high. It's not 79, and so it feels freezing because of the rate of transfer. That conduction. Certain uh, materials are going to conduct better than others, a lot better than others, and so that's what the oven mitt is. The oven mitt. There's like asbestos gloves for fires. You just reach into the fire and start moving the wood around in a fire with the asbestos gloves on, and so there are things that just don't conduct heat. I mean, if you reach into the fire and you have, like, your hand is covered in, I don't know, a water balloon or like a metal glove or something, that's going to end up bad. But so this is just let's stop the direct contact. It's just like putting a blanket down over the bleachers. And usually conduction doesn't matter much. Conduction doesn't matter much. Now, if you're in a pool, right, or you're in an ice bath or something, or if you are I don't know, there are situations in which conduction matters. It's you go lie down on a warm surface and your whole body is touching it. Okay, maybe there are conditions in which conduction matters, but usually it's just an amount of contact. Sitting on the bleachers, okay, you got like a couple of square feet, something like that, touching the metal. Your body is pretty big. Not much of your body relative to the whole is touching the bleachers, and let's just send some blood away from that area. Let's just vasoconstrict to that little tiny area. Oh, have you be uncomfortable a second, and then you're gonna warm it up. So it doesn't. Conduction is used in most circumstances. Conduction isn't that big of a deal. Now, radiation. So radiation is a give or take, but it's mostly a take. It's the sun is where most of this is coming from. So there's our visible wavelengths, right? But we have these wavelengths that are hotter up there, and it's just most of this of radiation is just going to be our accumulation of heat from the sun without touching it, right? It's not conduction. You don't go up and touch the sun, and it's not blowing over you. It's not like the sun isn't going with like wind. It's not like fluids that are washing over you, right? So it's radiation is how we get heat from the sun. Now we give off radiation too. Radiation is something we also release, and you can just see that on if you have the right equipment, right? If you have the right camera, you can see the radiation that we're emitting, but we're not emitting as much as we're getting usually. So, a direct hit, that's not necessary. You can get radiation when you're in the snow and the sun is reflecting off the snow. That works too. Now the environment might be cold, but getting that sunlight off the snow helps. Now, color matters, and texture, stuff like that too. But color, the darker the color, the more it's going to absorb it. Darker colors are going to absorb it more, which is the reason the puppy in the car with the fan blowing, really lethal. I mean, that's just caninicide or whatever. If you put the puppy in a hot day in a black car and the fan blowing, that's just how quickly can we kill puppies. Over here, there's going to be more reflected, more of that radiation exchange, that heat exchange, that thermal transfer reflected, not absorbed in white surfaces. And we see policies moving toward. I mean, you look at these sort of black asphalt and black roofs, and a city, an urban temperature is so much higher than anywhere else than nature, right? You get into these urban jungles, right? And any real jungle is not going to be that hot on these urban surfaces. And so people have been, since the 1990s, there's been a lot of legislation saying, let's just paint roads, let's paint roofs, let's paint things white. And it totally works. It works really well. Maybe it's not as aesthetic. Maybe it seems weird. Maybe it looks dirty or something, but you can't see the bird poop as much. Whatever it is, it works, right? This works really well. I mean, you start seeing these enormous temperature differences on these black surfaces, and that brings us back to the Arctic foxes. And here's a cute polar bear. This one's not going to go eat your head off, and just like bite off your limbs and eat them and stuff. But these hunters in the snow, okay, it is cold in the snow. It's cold as evidenced by snow everywhere. If it was not cold, that snow would have melted. And so it is really cold. They have to thermoregulate in these frosty, frigid climates. How do they thermoregulate when they're white? They're as white as the driven snow, right? So it comes down and reflects off of them, and they are not absorbing heat through radiation. They are very cute, I agree. They're not absorbing as much heat through radiation. So they have to increase their metabolic rate. Their metabolic rate has to increase with less work accomplished, right? So they're just releasing more energy as heat. And how do they do that if they're not eating a ton? Well, they're going to have to be able to eat a ton to be able to ramp up their metabolic rate to have thermal production enough to offset the loss in heat accumulation via radiation. So the white color makes them a better hunter. To be a better hunter means they are getting more food. They're accumulating more meat to metabolize that, and then they get the meat sweats, right? But they don't actually sweat. They just store that heat. And these things overlap. It's not just like, okay, here's this one and it's only by itself always forever. And here's this one and it's only by itself always forever. That's not how it works. These things overlap. So subcutaneous fat, right? If you have a lot of subcutaneous fat, there's some insulation there. And we're looking at this potentially affecting multiple areas, and probably the metabolic rate and work accomplished as well, right? The metabolic rate will probably be increased with all of your activities. You walk up the stairs and you're a little bit heavier, and your metabolic efficiency is down a little bit, and so there's a lot of this stuff begins to overlap. But this idea of insulation, this isn't new. Let's go to Herman Melville, right? 1850, Moby Dick, chapter 68, The Blanket. It's written, like a 19th century, mid 19th century book. But for the whale is indeed wrapped up in his blubber, as in a real blanket or counterpane, or still better, an Indian poncho slipped over his head and skirting his extremity. It is by reason of this cozy blanketing of his body that the whale is enabled to keep himself comfortable in all weathers, in all seas, times, and tides. What would become of a Greenland whale, say, in those suttering icy seas of the north, if unsupplied with his cozy surtout? So this idea of insulation, we've known about this for a long time. I mean, this was Herman Melville, who is not a physician or physiologist or researcher or of any sort, and it's been sort of common knowledge. So again, the elephant ears. Let's go back to those elephant ears. It's not they're not the BFG, right? Roald Dahl, big friendly giant. It is not to hear prey or predators or anything like that, right? It's like, oh, can I hear the leaves blowing in the wind from another mile away or something? It's thermal exchange, and you can. There's evidence of this if you start comparing different regions of elephants. In Africa, where the climate where the elephants live, I've seen elephants in the wild in Uganda. And I mean, there's some huge ears on the elephants in hotter climates. In Asia, I have not seen elephants in Asia, but the climate isn't as hot. Smaller ears in the Asian elephants, larger ears in the African elephants. What is the difference? Climate, right? I mean, let's go back to that idea of music. The David Byrne philosophy of the environment creates the creature. So you have an environment, and the creature forms. It's not just like, well, let's create an environment around a creature. That doesn't happen, other than human beings who the built environment that we make buildings with AC in them and stuff. But aside from human beings, the creature develops inside of an environment. The environment comes first, and those ears are well perfused. The ears on an African elephant, and any other elephant, very well perfused. It is surface area. So if you're a botanist, you're going to talk about the surface area of leaves. Right now, the leaves, this whole shape and this big flat thing is all surface area. It's the same thing for thermal transfer. Let's get as much surface area as we can. This has nothing to do with hearing. It's thermal exchange is what it's for. So, all of these things overlap. There's a lot of overlap in these, but these are the mechanisms of thermal exchange. The mechanisms of thermal exchange. And earlier I mentioned Bushra. She was one of our students who graduated in 2018. She left Pakistan when she was 4 years old, emigrated from Pakistan, came to the US, and I had her as a student several times. Wonderful student. We published at ACSM. And she went and visited Pakistan in 2017. And this is her right here. She's not the little tiny child, right? This is Busha right here. And she said she went grocery shopping and it took her about 5 hours. She was grocery shopping for 5 hours. I don't know what that looks like. That would be horrible for me, and no matter what temperature or climate or country. But oh, she was just struggling with heat exchange because, like, how do you evaporate? Convection isn't working. Conduction isn't going to do much anyway. But this thing is black, and so we're looking at more radiation. And so all of these, like, she is creating a bunch of metabolism. She's accomplishing work, but she's releasing heat. It's not evaporating. Where's it supposed to go? Convection isn't happening. There's no like strong gusts of wind just blowing right through her. And conduction isn't going to happen. I mean, this thing isn't a good, fabric, whatever it's made out of, isn't going to have good conduction. And the radiation is, that's like the worst thing you can wear in the heat. I'm not saying, making like a religious statement. I'm saying the worst thing for heat tolerance, for heat accumulation. And she felt it. She came back and was telling me all about her shopping trip. And I said, may I please use this? Can I put your picture in my slides? And she agreed. So I may have even snuck her in if she didn't agree, but she did agree. to have it in the slide. So, how we exchange heat, it's these things, right? No matter what the climate is, this is how we are accumulating or releasing our heat. Now, the detection and the regulation, remember the hypothalamus. We talked about the hypothalamus earlier when we were doing the axes, the hypothalamic, pituitary, whatever axes. So the hypothalamus is up here. We have the hypothalamus, then we have the pituitary down here. But the hypothalamus, this is really what's doing, not 100%. It's not 100% hypothalamus doing all of the regulation, but this is a huge a huge contributor, the bulk of contribution. Altered serum plasma, serum osmolality, that's going to matter on its own. Um, the measurement of solutes, of dissolved stuff, of solutes in the serum, your electrolytes, that's going to matter. But the hypothalamus, that's really the big regulatory center. So you remember Van Ness's 6 F's: food, or the fight, flight, fright, food, fluid, and fornication. The all of these F's. Um, when you're looking at stuff like fluid, right? So if it's hot, we begin to sweat. If it's sweat, we're losing fluids, right? We're losing fluids. And what is doing thirst? My hypothalamus is doing thirst. So some regulation of these fluids from that perspective. You're getting into some cardiac drift going on, right? You're sweating out to keep your temperature manageable, and your blood volume is going down, you're becoming a little bit dehydrated. Let's trigger some thirst. It's not that good at managing sensations of thirst. Most people tend to be a little bit dehydrated all the time, and sometimes we can confuse thirst and hunger, and we're not that good at you would know what the f. That was just that was that fight or flight or fright, food, fluid, and whoopee. We'll say is the sixth F. So I see what you're doing. Yeah. What the f. So anyway, the anterior portion of the hypothalamus, this is temperature rises. Temperature rises and we want to cool. That's anterior hypothalamus. The posterior portion we'll talk about later. Temperature falls. This is cold tolerance, cold accommodation. Thermal loads when it's heat. This is anterior hypothalamus, and we haven't always understood what cooling looks like. The reasons we cool, how we cool, their mechanisms, how to intervene and interact and support these things. Human history has missed the mark almost always. And really, the medical professionals, the people practicing, are the ones who really miss the mark. And then the researchers are like, no, that's not what I said. This is true. And then 20 years later, medical practice catches up. So if you start reading the literature, you're probably going to be 20 years ahead of what doctors are doing today. And it's been that way for most of human history. Now, there have been a few doctors who have made great progress. John Snow, right? He was an obstetrician, and he was the one who developed epidemiology. But for the most part, you look at research, and it tends to be at least a decade ahead of what the physicians are doing in their practice, because they're just doing what they learned in medical school, and what they learned in medical school is obsolete 10 years later. And so all throughout history, this is essentially what we're doing today. Is it what we're actually doing today, literally? No, it's figuratively what we're doing today. And in the 1970s, Theodoric of York was this SNL skit. That's Steve Martin, the comedian who plays the banjo. And he did this Theodoric of York character. He was a barber surgeon. Remember, it was the barbers were the ones who were doing surgery. The physician's like, no, that's beneath me. I'm a thinker. I don't do the cutting. That's gruesome. Barbarism. And You cut hair with those scissors. That what's one step removed from cutting flesh. Why don't you cut up that flesh? So this is a barber surgeon, but this is a publication. This is an SNL skit over here, but this is a legit publication from 1860, and talking about fevers. What do you do when someone presents with a fever? Well, there's a lot of ways to explain the fever. The easiest way is you're hot. It's very simple. You're very hot. Your temperature is high. So, with all this hot blood in you, let's let some of it out. Let's let some of this hot blood out of you. Now, it got a little bit more, quote, sophisticated than that as they talk about the balancing of humors. But even more ludicrous than the simple, you're hot, let's let hot blood out of you. That almost makes sense, right? But this is for fever. On the first attack, this is again 1860, a long time ago, but we're still doing sort of ridiculous things today. On the first attack, 30 ounces were immediately taken away. I'm talking about blood here, or the patient was generally bled to syncope. We'll bleed them until they pass out. They're unconscious. And the bleedings were repeated, often from the same orifice in a few hours afterwards, or from incisions in the opposite arm or frequency, whatever. So they just start bleeding people. All right, you come in with a fever. Okay, immediate presentation of fever, 30 ounces of blood. Maybe you're going to pass out. Maybe you'll be awake. Who knows? Let's see how far we can take this. 4 years later, same journal, 4 years later, and I mean, they're talking about more. I mean, they're still doing the same thing, talking about the mechanisms, the types of fever and bloodletting, and that treatment alone saved many from a premature grave. Now, this is a bold statement, right? Bloodlettings saved many people from a premature grave. Now, think about this. Physicians today say things that are that bold. And if you know the literature, you can look at them with a sort of a tilted head and be like, that's not how a cell works, right? That's not how um, thermal regulation works, or that's not how the endocrine system works, or that's not how cell signaling behaves, or what PKB does, or whatever. If you know physiology, you tilt your head, squint your eyes, and adopt a baffled, countenance. And so again, that treatment and that treatment alone saved many from a premature grave. How do we cool? What is the mechanism of cooling? Well, the couple of best ways to do it are to send a bunch of blood to the surface, to the skin, to the kind of outermost periphery, so that you can dissipate heat. You can exchange heat with the environment that's hopefully colder than your core temperature is. Oh shit, we're like way over time. I won't go that much longer. Sweating is the last thing we'll do, and we'll do it kind of quickly. Um, so one thing is, let's move blood to the surface. Well, if you have less blood, how do you move it to the surface? Well, you don't. Right? So you don't. So you compromise cooling that way. And then the biggest way that we cool is by sweating, right? Where are you going to draw that fluid from? What fluid do you have to draw from for your sweat if you've just drained 30 ounces of blood? Well, you don't. So you're going to die. Everybody dies from that. Nobody gets better from a bloodletting. I mean, this is outrageous, but people are like, this is how, that treatment alone. And so you will look at our first president, look at the $1 bill, right? December 1799, it's Friday the 13th. And he comes down with a fever. What do we do? I mean, this is before those 1860s publications. What do we do? Let's drain a bunch of blood. Let's drain a bunch of Washington's blood. Let's balance his humors. Let's get this hot fluid out of him. And over 12 hours, these repeated bloodlettings, 40% of his blood was removed. And what was the consequence? Death. Our first president was murdered by bloodletters. That's what happened. Right now, today, when you start to encounter, I'll go like 10 more minutes. Just take off if you want to take off. But I'll go like 10 more minutes just to talk a little bit more about sweating. But if you want to encounter reasonable medicine, you usually have to turn to the medical literature, because you're going to encounter nothing as crude or hilarious as bloodletting, but it's going to be at least a decade behind the current information that you'll see in the medical literature is what's being practiced. So how do creatures cool? How do creatures find cooling? If you're a lizard, right? If you're a little scaly guy, go change your environment. Go sit in the sun. You're going to see lizards sitting in the sun. Okay, let me go absorb some of this heat. Cats and dogs, you're going to pant a bunch, right? Okay, let's have some evaporative cooling. Um, let's get some convection going, and we'll get a little bit of evaporative cooling from mucous membranes. And if you're a rhino, if you're a hippo, you're going to lounge in the swamp. If you're a wood stork, you just shit all over your legs. Let's get some evaporation that way. If you're a snail, estivation, which is hibernation in hot spells, right? You want to not contribute metabolism. You don't want to contribute your own thermal load to this. So you just go sleep away. You hibernate away the hot spell. You don't want to dehydrate yourself. You don't want to contribute to your own thermal load. So you just minimize your metabolism. So estivation. For people, we don't really pant. Maybe some of us do. Hopefully we don't, have like feces running down our legs. We're not hiding in swamps. Most of what we're doing is sweating. Sweating is the bulk of our thermal exchange. Evaporation, we've known about this for a long time, but not in the level of detail we know about it today. So the identification of the pores through which water arises. Water comes from these pores. This was BC. Right? I mean, this is a long time ago. Of like, oh, we have water that starts to come through these pores. Now, it doesn't have to come in full beads, right? Sweat isn't just beads. And this was Galen. I mentioned Galen earlier when I was talking about the recurrent laryngeal nerve, that it should just go straight to the larynx, but like it has this in a giraffe, it takes this hilarious circuitous route to get there. It takes that route in everybody, people too, but in a giraffe, it just gets so long. But sweat, it isn't just beads, it's constantly dissipating, which is the reason you are sweating at rest and you don't quite see it, and why I said there's 0.36, 0.37, 0.35, something like that, milligrams per centimeter per minute of sweat that's just building and leaving and building and leaving. And a bead of sweat also doesn't dissipate whole. You don't just you don't have like a bead of sweat and then go and it just dissipates whole. It just like poofs off into the air. A drop of water has an enormous amount, a sextillion, an enormous amount of these water molecules, and they're not uniform. Each individual molecule in there is not uniform in its kinetic energy, and the ones with the highest kinetic energy leave first. So it's not arbitrary or random how your sweat is dissipating. But so the actual glands themselves, so the eccrine pores as opposed to apocrine pores, and the actual sweat glands, Purkinje. You know what a Purkinje fiber is? If you can remember back to some elementary physiology stuff, those fibers, the Purkinje fibers, are the things that distribute an electrical impulse throughout the ventricles. You're in your heart, throughout the ventricles. Let's get that electrical impulse sent throughout them. That wasn't the only thing Purkinje did. The actual sweat glands he identified too. Counting of the sweat glands. This is fascinating. So, a long time, 1844, really long time ago, Karl Kraus decides, I'm going to count up the sweat glands. And he publishes a number, 2,381,248. Very precise, and it's pretty much right. I mean, this is 1844, and it's pretty much there. I mean, there's variation, and it depends how you count them and what do you count but it's right around there is the number of sweat glands we have. Two different kinds of sweat glands, though. The eccrine sweat glands, right? This is cooling over here. Water and sodium is going to come out of here, and then the apocrine sweat glands. This is the oils, right? And this is the bacterial colonization. This is the odors. This is what deodorant is made to defend against, is the apocrine sweat glands. So again, Karl Kraus, right down here. This guy was close. Maybe we have as many as 4 million, but it's probably around the 2 million marks, right around his number. Men and women tend to be about the same, somewhere in that 2 million range, and they're not all active. There's some inactive glands in there, but embryonic development, it's going to matter. your heat stress early in life. This is going to help determine some of your development, some of your number of sweat glands, this total surface area of your body. There's a lot of determinants of these things. Acetylcholine is going to be the trigger. So you're going to have these eccrine sweat glands. Acetylcholine is going to trigger them. Temperature goes up. Remember the anterior hypothalamus. We're in the anterior hypothalamus that responds, and acetylcholine is going to initiate sweating from the eccrine glands. And again, we talked about this, the sweat rate at rest and sweat rate during work. It's going to go up way up at work. And if you're super uh, you know, thermal, adapted. If you're heat tolerant, Alberto Salazar was this great. He's still alive, but he's not a competitor, I don't think. He was this great marathon runner, and man, that guy could sweat more than you can drink. So the rate that you can drink and the rate that he could sweat, these are not the same thing. So he was going to dehydrate himself during the race no matter what, because he could not kind of empty his stomach of the fluids he consumed during the race fast enough to supply how much he was sweating. He was tested by Larry Armstrong, the person I mentioned earlier, a huge name. I mentioned him in the context of he would lecture with a rectal thermometer in at the time, and Larry Armstrong tested Alberto Salazar for his sweat rate, and he had to put tape over the electrical sockets because he was just pouring out of there. Amazing runner, right? His cooling capacity. Now it can start to be a little bit of a compromise when it's like, man, you're just getting super dehydrated. You're at mile 10 and your like mouth is parched, right? You can't drink fast enough. Sequence of body segments. This varies. The sequence is going to vary person by person of what comes early and what comes late. But your forehead tends to be a very early contributor, and the dorsal surface of your foot tends to be a very late contributor. But this sequence of body segments, it varies person by person. And um, the big sweating areas, the areas with the highest density of where we're sweating, this is also a little bit, it's variable, right? For somebody at rest, okay, the forehead, the dorsal side of the fingers a little bit. If you're walking or something, your hands are moving around, that's helpful. Your upper back a little bit. You get into exercise, and the back tends to be a pretty big contributor to sweat. And your upper limbs more than your lower limbs, upstairs more than downstairs tends to contribute, but very, very um, diverse, right? Very diverse person by person, how that's going to work. And again, the highest sodium output and lowest sodium output varies person by person, but these tend to be the areas where if you're going to measure, if you want high sodium, all right, check a chest, right? Check some thighs, and you're probably going to see higher sodium. Lower sodium, and maybe the palms of the hands, soles of the feet, stuff like that. When you're exercising, you are likely to get more sodium loss during exercise, during high intensity activity, during a sport, during physical activity, during meat butchering, whatever it is during activity. You're likely to lose a little bit more sodium. And I mentioned this earlier, if you get a tattoo over an area that is going to sweat. So right here we have the chessboard. I doubt this is like a world champion in chess, but in his forehead, he's going to have of compromised sweat in this patch and that 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 patch. And he will sweat better from this patch and that patch and that patch and that patch. And so his sweat rate may be compromised. And so this is the study that I saw first at the ACSM conference, and I took pictures of the poster. Like, I've never seen this before, and then it immediately came out a month later or something like that in Medicine, Science, Sports, and Exercise as the full article. And at least sweet pea, that's diabetes. But if we start to see the non-tattooed skin and the tattooed skin, I mean, it's half. right? You're cutting the sweat rate in half, from non-tattooed skin to tattooed skin. And then more sodium is also being lost in the sweat. So compromised sweat rate in tattooed skin, P is 0.001, meaning if there were no relationship in real life. If the null hypothesis is true, meaning there's nothing to do with tattooed skin and sweat rate, that's the null hypothesis. If the null hypothesis were true, meaning there's no connection between tattoos and sweat rate, then there's only a 0.1% chance, a 0.1% chance that we would have observed, these researchers would have observed an effect this extreme or more extreme than that. So pretty compelling, pretty compelling. And it's the same thing. There's a 2% chance, P of 0.02, in the increased sodium loss. And so area, now here, foreheads and stuff, good exchange, good thermal exchange. In those limbs, that's going to compromise thermal exchange, right? In the chest, that's going to compromise some thermal exchange. Armpits, you're not compromising thermal exchange, so that's looks like what he's doing. Apocrine sweat glands, that's not a way of cooling. Eccrine sweat glands are a way of cooling, so tattoo up your armpits all you want, put on all the deodorant you want. That has nothing to do with cooling. But if you think of some of this stuff, this is I would consider this fine, right? There's no tattoos, no tattoos. The jersey is over this, right? The jersey is over that, and that's going to compromise sweat anyway. That jersey is going to compromise sweat anyway. When you get into this, that's potentially problematic for thermal regulation, and we know as heat accumulates, you can't perform. Just ask LeBron James. Ask LeBron James how easy it is to perform when your core temperature gets elevated. He did one play and he was carried off the court. If he could cool much better, you can continue to play. The back tends to be a good spot for sweating. This, like, he tattooed everything but his armpits. That's like the only place that the sweating is unlikely to have anything to do with thermal regulation. He's like, the kick me or I dare you or whatever it says. Like, okay, you couldn't catch me because, like, look, man, you're not going to be able to cool. It's like it's hot out and you're like under the tree panting. Like, you're not going to be able to. You're like a dog on a walk. You don't have thermal regulation anymore. So being aware of the variables that can compromise performance. It depends what the performance is. Is the performance heaving? Tattoos aren't going to matter. You don't need to sweat. You don't need to cool. You're a shot putter. You're a javelin thrower. You're a sprinter. That doesn't matter. If you run 100 meters, that's not a matter of cooling. It has nothing to do with the run. You're a high jumper, whatever. You could be one big tattoo. You could just tattoo your entire body blue or whatever. That's totally fine. For endurance activity, of which basketball is one of them, we're looking at compromise, very likely compromised performances. More data would still have to come out. So this will be the last slide. The purpose of apocrine sweat glands, these oily sweat glands. So you're going to have these things in your groin, in your armpits. I mean, these are the things people like bathe with keen attention, paying keen attention to. What people used to say was these odors were very intoxicating. These are enticing, and these fragrances are going to lure us into the sixth F, right? Into copulation, and that just sounds stupid to me. There is evidence, a lot of it, that the earliest recorded human history, we've been remedying this thing, right? In the 4th century BC in Egypt, people were already, it was common practice to expel these scents, to disguise, to cover and expel these scents with bath oils, with perfumes. Let's try to hide the sense of humanity, right? 4th century BC. These appalling, disgusting scents. We need to eliminate these things. Late 19th century, that's when underarm deodorant. That's when let's get some chemicals that are going to target the primary culprits in the creation of this scent. That's when we started generating all of these antiperspirants and deodorants, and we never looked back. I mean, there's a huge market for these things. And so there's really no evidence that the musk of a person. Now, okay, people was like, oh, there's a like sniff the sweaty shirt, and is this sombo? Which one is least unappealing to you? Fine, whatever. But we, as a species, we don't find these scents, you know, enticing or alluring, and there must be an alternative explanation. Why are we getting all this oil in our groin? Why are we getting all this oil in our armpits? Well, think about the adrenergic as opposed to cholinergic fibers that are stimulating all of this is nervousness and panic and alarm and stress. We are it's not just thermal load, right? It's sort of emotion is what's going to stimulate this, and you're going to be stimulated into action at this point, right? This adrenergic stimulation, you're going to be stimulated into action. Do you need to run? Right. Well, let's get some lubricant. Right. Let's not chafe ourselves raw as we speed away, all slick and safe and sound as we flee from the scene, or whatever it is, and also in your hands, in the palms of your hands, and on your feet. There are adrenergic eccrine fibers. And so you get really nervous, and you have your like wet hands. You're like, oh, I'm sorry, I have hyperhidrosis or something. You shake someone's hand and they like shake it off afterward. Where that's also, you're going to see these sweaty palms at the same time that you see like sweaty pits and sweaty groins. And this is all, it would be ideal for action. Let's say you have like a sword or a hammer or a stick, a club or something like that in your hand. These dry hands, if you're going to hold, let's say you're a baseball bat or something, like you like spit on your hands a little bit, get them a little bit wet and hold it back, the coefficient of friction changes. You change the coefficient of friction and you increase the thermal and tactile sensation in your hands at the same time. So there's a performance element in hands. Life wasn't about shaking hands in the assembly of our genome. That wasn't helping you survive and win fights and stuff. Oh, I need to shake hands better. Oh, I better not have a wet handshake. That wasn't helpful. But increasing a coefficient of friction, this wasn't like holding a metal ball where it's like now it's all wet or whatever. It's like let's hold a stick or something. And so there are explanations. There are valid sounding explanations of the pits, and valid explanations of the groin, of like, let's not chafe ourselves until we're like scabbing over next time. All right, that's all I have. So, I went way over. Friday we'll go short. Well, we'll compensate on Friday. We won't do too much. Questions, or is that just so long that like I have abused questions right out of your minds?
I have a question.
Okay.
So I was listening to a podcast a while ago, and this lady, she's a biochemist, and she promoted athletes going into saunas after their workouts, especially ones who experience a lot of contact in their sports, because it promotes neurogenesis, the heat. That's what she said. But I was like, but over time, so it's that in moderation, it could be okay, but in excess, you could develop heat stroke and all those things.
Yeah. So anything sub heat illness, if you don't get heat illness, most things are totally fine. And I haven't seen this particular literature, so I wouldn't be able to comment on the probably validity of that literature, because I haven't read it. But there are some things that a sauna is good for. And if you hang out in there until heat illness, okay, now you have a problem. Just like exercise, there's an enormous number of things that exercise will enhance, but exercise to excess, okay, now you have the equivalent of heat illness, right? You have overreaching, overtraining, you have hypothalamic dysregulation, stuff like that. So there's probably truth to it, but I haven't read that literature. I would have to find it, and I'm not sure how compelling, if it's early literature, if it's something that's just emerging and there's limited data. So I'm really not sure. Or if it's like since 1912 but nobody's looked at it since. So I'm really not sure. biochemists are very smart. I trust she's reading actual studies or conducting them
Yeah.
herself. It was she.
Yeah, she works at the Oakland Institute of Aging.
Okay.
And so I think she was looking at it from like, she sounds like a lot of boxers did a lot better neurologically in their brain from taking the punches if they were to go into a sauna after they worked out.
Oh, that's fascinating. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe I'll Google it. And that can be in our application section if I find the literature, or if you find it, if you like send me a link.
Yeah. Her name, I can write her name in the chat box.
Okay.
Is that to do with the heat shock proteins?
Maybe I would have to read. I haven't read any of
Yeah.
them.
She said something. I remember her talking about heat
Okay.
shock proteins and about it.
Okay. Rhonda Patrick.
I wanted to ask, when you talked about the odors and whatever, I've heard like kind of colloquially about pheromone release and kind of sexual signaling through that. Is that a myth, kind of fallacy, or is...
I think people will make a lot of commotion about very small things sometimes, especially somebody who discovers something. They name it after themselves. This is my discovery, and this is like the Jensen phenomenon, I would call it, and then I would spend my life defending it and pretending it's super. I mean, Hans Selye, great example of in the face of contrary evidence, that guy just kept running his mouth about generalities of adaptation. Like, it was insane after a while. And it's just pheromones. I think people will just make a huge deal about something that's likely very small. Now, a really long time ago, I think I was living in Chicago at the time. In passing, I saw this study about it was like shirts. It was like sweaty shirts, and it was a pheromone study or something. But I do think women have what's called a vomeronasal organ that's more for pheromone detection than men do, and I think and so there's all these are sort of old things I was looking at that I really don't think any of it makes much of a difference at all. That there was one thing that was saying like, oh, your genes are compatible. If you like the sweat of this shirt, whatever, you have more compatible genomes. What the hell does that mean though? More compatible genomes? How the hell do you know? What like in the alignment of mommy and daddy, what's going to be the most opportunistic, pairings of like, what? So I think people okay, I am somewhere close to illiterate on that subject. I've encountered a few things and I skimmed them and I sort of shrugged or like, scowled. And I haven't given it its fair due for reading, but it doesn't seem, I mean, find somebody who's like, oh yeah, just let me smell your pits. Like, find somebody who has like a penchant for pit sweat. Like, it just doesn't, like, we've been, since recorded history, we've been trying to suppress this thing because we all just sort of find it appalling. And so I just don't think there's that much evidence that like pheromones are an important sexual selection criterion. I could be wrong. I'm not saying that with any authority. I'm not saying that with certainty, anything like that.
Okay, interesting.
I was gonna ask, like, for heat injuries, is there always symptoms of like if it's gonna occur, or sometimes can you just like have heat exhaustion or heat stroke?
It is a really good question about detection. Some people have this constitutional resilience, and they can exercise to the point of overtraining. They can run to the point of heat stroke. And other people, oh, my toe hurts a little bit, I better stop. I think we talked about this earlier, where how do you tell? Ricky was talking about different athletes, and how do you know who's malingering and who shouldn't be back when we're talking about return to play testing conditions. And some people just want to play on and play on and play on, and maybe they even look almost normal. And other people are just sidelined and they're like merely warmed up. And so I think there are the breadth of people. I think you will encounter some folks who aren't giving all of the signs of a heat stroke yet. Now, some of it, there was this old study, I think it was in the 40s, where people became keto adapted. You just no carbs, get you keto adapted. Who cares about carbohydrates? Your central nervous system runs on ketones. Your brain is this ketone burning machine. You didn't really notice carbs. And then they gave him insulin shots. Now you can never do this study today. No way you could do this study today, because if you do that to somebody who's not keto adapted, they die. They clear out their blood sugar and they go into like a coma. And no way you could do that study. But like a bunch of decades ago, they did it, and all these keto adapted people, like, they didn't even notice. They're fine. The central nervous system was just like, oh, I don't know, I'm okay. Right? I could feel better. I mean, it wasn't a big severe thing, because their central nervous system didn't really care about the sugar. The ketones were abundant. And my hunch is there's a similar phenomenon with something like heat stroke, where there are people who have metabolic and neurological constitutions who aren't really going to be affected until it's dire.
Yeah. Yeah, it just reminds me because, I actually never thought about it until now that we talked about it. But I remember one time I was competing in a cross country race, and this guy who's like really, really fast. He always beats me all the time. But like we're racing, and then out of nowhere, like he seemed like we're like shoulder and shoulder, and out of nowhere he just collapses, right? Like passes out, and I haven't talked to him since then, so I don't know what happened. But like, I guess now it sounds maybe like he had like maybe heat stroke or something.
So it's probably dissipation of heat was inadequate. Central nervous system decided, nah, you're done.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about some of this, like, why, if you're standing, if you're upright, blood is being pooled down, maybe you've lost a lot of fluid, your blood volume is low, and you're having a hard time cooling. If you just lay down, well, now it's easy to send blood around. You're not fighting gravity. You're not contributing to the thermal load with all of these calories being expended if you're at 15 METs or whatever. And so it's easy, just lie down. That's the best thing you can do. Is just allow your blood to do what it's supposed to do, and to cool down the best you can, and stop contributing to the thermal acquisition. So that's probably what happened, but it could be something else. Maybe there was diabetes and glucose regulation. I mean, there could be any number of things, but commonly you see thermal complications.
Yeah, 'cause I was gonna ask about that too, because I had a teammate that had like diabetes, and then one time that happened to him too. Like he like passed out, but like there were signs. Like we were like running, and then I heard him like making noises and doing weird things, and then
Yeah, you get loopy.
yeah, and
Yeah,
then
if it's a blood sugar problem, when the blood sugar gets low, you get loopy first, and you might be loopy to see it in yourself. That's the problem. When your blood sugar gets really low and you're not keto adapted, when your blood sugar gets really low, even if you are keto adapted and it's like really low, you're likely to experience some loopiness, and that's your brain is making you loopy, and that's the same brain that would recognize those symptoms, and so like it's like you're oblivious to it, and everyone else is like, whoa, you're weird, and it's so important for the whoa, you're weird people to go put some jelly beans in your mouth, or like squirt some juice at you or something. But yeah, so there tends to be a slightly different presentation of glycolytic kind of glucose levels being depleted, and thermal load. The presentation tends to be a little bit different. Or maybe you just have like a seizure. I don't know. Sometimes that happens too. I mean, it's actually not that uncommon.
Or because that guy we know for sure that like goes diabetes or something, and then the other guy like I don't know, but he had no symptoms. Like we were just running, and all of a sudden he just collapsed. But I was also gonna ask you about, you said
narcolepsy. I don't know.
Yeah.
a lot of possibilities, but okay, what else?
You said like I think you just had like 1 liter of water we lose, like it's about 600 calories or something like that, right? In sweat. So like with like fitness watches and stuff, when it burns calories, is it including that? Like, is it estimating the calories burnt only by heart rate, or is it estimating it also by sweat loss, or is it using heart rate to determine
Oh, okay, I
sweat
see.
loss?
Yeah,
Or
it's just heart rate. It's just heart rate and sort of there's a lot of assumptions made. And so I actually never look up how many calories I burn. It's just how many
right?
steps I get and what my
Yeah,
sleep score is like that's all I really look at. But um yeah, it's just gonna be the heart rate and some assumption of how many calories that corresponds to. It's a crude assessment, but it's consistent. That's the nice part about these fitness watches is it actually accurate? Well, no. But is it
right.
consistent with you where on this day, you burn this amount of calories. On this day, you burn that amount of calories. That proportionate difference, the proportions are honest and reflective and accurate of you, and so like with my sleep score, is my actual sleep, my REM and my deep and whatever, is that like if I went into a sleep study, if I went to there's a sleep center in Stockton, if I went there and had them measure everything, is it going to line up with this? No, but this is consistent where I know on Monday, here's what my sleep is like. On Tuesday, here's what my sleep is like. And Tuesday was good
Right.
and this one was bad. And so that's, I think, the benefit of fitness watches is individual tracking, not necessarily precision of the measurement, but accuracy of the representation to the individual.
Yeah, that makes sense. Interesting. So when it uses the heart rate, though, is I guess is it using heart like calories based off of just heart rate from I guess like how many calories you would burn from this heart rate, or is it using that heart rate to determine if you're at this heart rate, you're probably sweating this much, you're probably doing this much work? Is it like considering all of that, or just
Yeah, I think it's probably, I don't know the answer because I never looked it up, but my
yeah,
hunch is that it's just Met values. If your
yeah,
heart rate is in this range, here's your Mets. And you can
okay,
calculate how many if you're at like 3 Mets, you're at 4 Mets, you can calculate how many calories that equates to. Again, is it perfectly accurate? No, but it's a pretty good ballpark figure. And so you're at 2 Mets, 3 Mets, 4 Mets, 5 Mets. And I think that's probably what it's doing is here's your heart rate now, here's your Met value and your Met minutes, how long you spent at that Met value, and then your recovery. And so I think that's probably the sort of equation and calculation that is doing.
yeah, okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. I'll see you on Friday.
Sounds good. Bye. Have a good one.
You too.
Jensen, did you still want to talk after or?
Sure. Yeah. Let me stop the recording.
Cool.